later, so I'll have this ready to go. I may forget. I had it ready to go last week and just forgot to use it, so. All right, again, I've got handouts available if you want to get one to follow along and take notes. There's also still copies of the book available if you have been thinking about wanting to read a copy but haven't made the decision to grab one. There's no charge for those. You can just grab them on your way out. Also, John is going to be teaching a class. When does that start?
June 5th.
June 5th. Okay, so basically as soon as I'm done in here, the next Sunday after I'm done with this.
Working up to it to get everybody.
So in preparation, because John's going to be going through a lot of the history of Israel, and it's probably easier to have that discussion if you've already been kind of refreshing yourself on that with what he's going to get into with the prophets in context of the history. He's got handouts. Either you can come see him or there were some on the chair on your way in if you want to prepare for that. Yeah, so I'll be back in the high school class, so I'll be able to join you, but I'll give you that to hand out. So. All right, we are going to pick up right where we left off last week. If you have the older version of the book that had the red bookmark in it that I prepared, it's chapter 7. If you've been reading the newer version, because they reprinted in between when I ordered sets, with the blue bookmark, it's chapter 6. And we're going to be talking about the eyewitness or the witnesses of Jesus. Eyewitnesses, but there are others as well. And are the witness accounts that were used to construct the scriptures that tell us what we need to know about Jesus, are those witness reports, those witness accounts, something that we can be confident in relying on to have given us the truth about who Jesus is? Again, I just remind you that what we're doing is seeking to look at as much of the evidence as possible surrounding who Jesus was, what he said, what he did, most importantly, who he claimed to be, which is the Son of God and the prophesied Messiah, indeed, who had been God coming down in flesh, in the form of a man, to save us. That's the most important part of everything that we do. So remember, I don't want us to get bogged down in all of the details, because all of this evidence points to something a lot more important than the evidence itself. We talked about in the first week that faith is being sure of what we don't see, being convicted of the things that our senses can't see, hear, taste, touch, all of these things. The evidence that we get are the things that we can sense that help to confirm what Jesus said. And so the evidence is not what we want to put our faith in. We want to use the evidence to be more confident in our faith and make sure our faith is targeted in the right place, which is in Jesus himself, not in all of these facts that we're talking about, even though these are going to help us along the way. And so getting to where we are today, we looked at, again in week 1, this statement that based on all of the claims that Jesus made, different than any other human being who's ever walked the planet, because he claimed to be the Son of God. Well, based on the things that he said, he's either lying about it, or he's crazy, so he wasn't in his right mind when he made the claims, or what he said was all true, and he's Lord. And we also threw in the caveat that some people have raised an objection to this, what's called the trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord, and said, well, what if the claims themselves are wrong? What's recorded isn't actually what Jesus said. So we need to address, was Jesus a legend? We started last week by looking at, we broke this into 3 parts. Is the text itself, the Bible text that we have, does this reflect the original writing? We needed to be confident of that, because it's the original writers who were inspired, the original handwritten manuscripts that contained the inspired words. Has that been preserved faithfully for us? We answered yes last week, that we are greater than 99% confident based on the actual textual evidence that we have. Word for word, letter by letter, we know exactly what it said. And we looked at the authors. The authors themselves were reliable. Those original words that were handwritten. And again, we came away with saying, yes, we believe there is sufficient evidence to be confident enough to stake our faith on the original words of Scripture based on those authors' reliability. But what about the things that those authors, those witness statements that those authors were using to write their words? Are those witnesses reliable? The people that claim to have seen Jesus and testified to that to people like Luke or to Mark as they were writing down their Gospels. Because Luke and Mark were not eyewitnesses of Jesus. They were collecting accounts from other people who were. So Are those witnesses reliable? And if we can answer yes to all three of these things, then I think we can state with confidence that what we know about Jesus, it's not legend, it's historical, it's fact. And it points us directly to the literal truth about Jesus, not something that's been embellished or changed over time to now represent something that it didn't originally. So let's give a check mark there and say today we're going to look at these eyewitness accounts. I also remind you, this is important, and I'm going to keep saying this as much as I can, remind you that because we are often accused of being people of faith, that we're being unscientific when we choose to be people of faith, when we choose to put our faith in Jesus. Again, I mentioned our faith is in Jesus that helps us make that jump across all of those things that we can't see, those things that we weren't there for. We're never going to know from the perspective of, I saw it with my own eyes and I observed it. Well, that's true for all of history. None of us were in France in the early 1800s to witness what Napoleon said or did, but we have histories and eyewitness accounts and written records of that time, so we can know with confidence what the life of Napoleon was like and what he did as a general and so forth and as emperor of France. Well, that is not a scientific pursuit to uncover all of that. It's a historical pursuit, and you use a very different method of investigation. And so what we're doing in this exercise, where we are looking at the historicity of Jesus and what that evidence points to, is we're using what's called the historical method, not the scientific method. I can refer you back to previous recorded videos as we went through this in detail, if you'd like to go back and refresh on that. So we're going to talk about witness testimony a lot today. Let me ask you this, first of all. In general, do you think is witness testimony something that we should treat as reliable evidence if we're going to be trying to answer questions? Larry, I'm going to do my best to run around with this. Larry, what do you think about witness testimony and its reliability as a source of evidence? I'm going to give you 30 seconds.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so 30 seconds. Okay. One thing that I think is to keep in mind is that if these witnesses were stating the things that they stated in the context that they were, if it wasn't fundamentally true, they would have been challenged and it would never got off the ground.
Yeah.
And also, it was counter to the Jewish thought process, and even to the point where they tried to kill the people that were the beneficiaries of Jesus' miracles.
Yes.
And that's just not possible to be able to put that out there unless it actually happened. They would have killed their testimony from the word go.
Yeah. Think about that. What he just said there. Witness testimony, when you make it in a very over something as public as this, if you say something that's untrue, there's plenty of people watching that are going to tear it down if you said something untrue. If you're in a court situation and you're a witness and you say something false, and the defense has or the prosecution, whichever side you're on, the other side has something to prove that what you said was false, they're going to bring it up and tear apart your testimony. So testimony is good. It's good for reliability because it can be opposed. Yeah, John.
Well, going back about 2,000 years from, 2000 BC, 1000, the big difference between what we're seeing here is almost all the literature that was written historically, no one ever cared what the average person had to say.
Okay.
It was always the kings.
Okay.
And so this is a completely new thing that they're actually talking and writing the average person. You almost never, ever hear anything from the average person.
Yeah.
So this was completely different. So it's most likely they were very, very careful because it rarely was ever done back then.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you read some of the people who have written histories on how the Gospels were developed and think about what this type of literature is. We read these and we say, oh, well, that's great. That's historical narrative. Like, that wasn't a literary thing at this time. These were groundbreaking works, like what Luke did to write his Gospel, to write the book of Acts. That's groundbreaking in the literary world for what it was. Histories weren't written to that detail to go to the average person and get so many points of view to put together. So, yeah, there's something powerful in these specific Gospels. Any other, before I get to my points, any other thoughts on this idea as witness testimony, something we could consider as reliable evidence? Larry. Got one more point here.
Well, there's also undesigned correlation and confirmation in the witness testimony. For instance, all the details in the book of Acts. If you were trying to fabricate a story, the less detail, the better, because
Yes.
there's less things that you can get caught up in.
Yes.
Did they go over to this harbor? Did it really take this long to get from here to here? Did this person really exist? Less is more if you're trying to deceive somebody. But the
Absolutely.
details were incidental across the various documents, meaning the Gospels, as well as the letters and and the timelines. They all
Yeah.
match.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much detail here, right? So testimony is one thing, but detailed testimony. If you're making it up, who's ever told a lie and then you had to tell another lie to cover it up? And another lie after that to keep covering up, and then maybe at some point you stumble over it and you forget which lie you told to which person. I was a kid once. I did this to my parents and tell my dad one thing and my mom another thing, right? You get caught in that very quickly over some very simple stuff, not the least of which is this man who claimed to be the Son of God in a religious world that was very skeptical. The first century Jewish world would have been very skeptical of someone who claimed that. They're watching this closely, right? Well, think about witness testimony. If you are on trial for something, you're a defendant in court, and you have now a body of witnesses coming to testify in your behalf to plead your innocence. And think about some important considerations about what you want out of that witness testimony. For example, you probably want as many eyewitnesses as possible instead of secondhand witnesses. You want people who were there, who saw you in this place at this time to make your alibi stick, right? You don't, yeah.
They don't allow secondhand witnesses.
Right, even better, right?
Hearsay principle.
Right, so even if you don't have eyewitnesses, really witness testimony does nothing for you. But what about this? More witnesses. You want a lot of witnesses, not just a few, right? The more witnesses you have, that the story all comes together. The details will be different from person to person because maybe this person saw me at this time and this person saw me at another time, but together you piece together the story. Say you've got 5 or 6 rather than 1 or 2. All right, it's a lot easier to make a case if everybody's in agreement. You're actually telling the truth, right? What about witnesses with multiple perspectives of bias? It's great to have witnesses who are sympathetic to you. What about if you have people who would be considered a neutral point of view who also say, yeah, that happened? Or somebody who might actually be considered to be against you in some form who can also stand up and say, yeah, that happened and I saw that. I didn't like it, but it happened. We talked about last week with the Pharisees who were talking amongst themselves in John chapter 11 after Lazarus was raised from the dead. They're like, well, how are we going to stop this guy? He's performing an awful lot of miracles, and people are going to start believing in him really soon. Like, they said the quiet part out loud, I think is the phrase that you hear a lot now. They admitted that he was doing the miracles, and they saw the evidence of it, even though they didn't like it and they wanted him to stop. And so you get witnesses who are not only for you, but also against you. That's a powerful case to build, right? Well, I say this because there's a loud movement among skeptics and atheists to say that, well, just because the Bible's full of testimony is not really good evidence. We need something harder. We need better proof than just testimony, because testimony is not strong evidence. Carl Sagan, a lot of people above a certain age know who that is. I know who that is, so I'm with you. Younger than me, I don't know. You know who Carl Sagan is? Okay. Sorry to pick on you there, Emily. He's quoted as saying this: I believe that the extraordinary should certainly be pursued, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Anybody heard this phrase before? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And there are some people out there who would argue, and if you go watch their debates on YouTube, they vehemently argue that testimony does not equal extraordinary evidence, and definitely not enough for me to rely on to make a faith claim. Problem is, a lot of times what I'm seeing as I watch some of these atheists present their case is they conflate, and I'm going to tell you this is something that you got to be careful on. They conflate claims and testimony. Those are not the same thing in my argument, in my point of view, but what do you think? Are claims and testimony the same thing? And if you think they are not, what makes them different? Are claims and testimony the same thing? So someone can make, like, say Jesus made a claim, or someone in the Gospels made a claim about Jesus. Is that the same as testifying, or what's different? Let me come to Sarah, and then I'll come back up to you, John. Get some different voices in here.
You don't have to talk loud enough, right?
I know, but I got to have the microphone up there pick it up too. So
Claims are an assertion that something happened. A testimony is something that you saw happen.
yeah,
Or that you
Yeah.
experienced happening in some way. So it's
Right.
like, I think that the sky is purple, but I see that the sky is blue as a difference,
so
claims
the
and
the
testimony.
difference in saying, what did you said an assertion that something happened
Yeah.
versus someone who
Something that you experienced or saw happening. Yeah.
right. What else? Any other thoughts on this? Yeah, okay, David, should have just kept the microphone there on the Pag and Cough row. Go ahead.
Well, I was just kind of really going to continue in the agreement that I think there is a distinction because, like, see, they're thinking, and why it can be confusing is that
Yes.
you could make the claim Jesus raised someone from the dead.
Yes.
Well, that is a claim.
Yes.
But if I saw it happen,
Yes.
it's testimony.
There you go.
So that's where that conflation can really happen. But in that situation, it is both testimony and a claim,
Right.
but it's testimony.
Right.
So yeah.
That little bit of a wrinkle there. Yeah, Larry, and then I'm going to run up and grab John, and then we're going to make it to the front row again.
I was thinking about J. Warner Wallace's talking about how you build a case. What's reasonable a doubt?
Yes.
In other words, yeah, it's true. I could give Carl Sagan the point that, you're making some claims and you don't have hard evidence. But what's the reasonable alternative to the fact that the Romans didn't produce the body? Right?
Spoiler alert for next week. Yes.
Oh, okay. But
No, you're good.
that's the idea. When you're building a case, it's like, yeah, I could deny that Jesus exists, but you're going to have to jump over a lot of evidence
That's right.
to make that sure.
That's right. John McConkey, final word here.
What's interesting, because as you guys know, I watch court all the time, and one of the big things when things before the jury, the testimony before the jury, best friends are not the people look at the jury even. Most of them like, yeah, whatever. They're just friends.
Yeah.
But it's the extra people,
Yeah.
like the centurion or the other person who testifies, who said it. The people, the guys at the cross who looked up and said these things.
Yeah.
That's who the jury goes. Yeah, now I believe it. Because anybody who's a friend, you're lying. But anybody who's outside of that and see it, and the more people that see it, the more people that do it outside of that, it's 100% by that point.
Yeah. There was a very important statement made. I like how David brought this out, that this can be a little confusing when you think about it. But so the claim that Jesus walked on water versus someone saying, I saw Jesus walk on water. So that extra teeth of, I'm putting my reputation on the line. Here's who I am, and I'm saying that this happened because I saw this. That's some extra muscle behind what the statement is, because anybody can make a claim, right? But can someone else back it up? That's when it becomes testimony, right? So I can make a claim that I can run a mile in 4 minutes. I can just say that. I'm not going to prove it to you. You just believe me, right? But I can't. I never could, never will. But somebody who claims that now has to, say, well, did anybody ever time you and write this down? Or did anybody ever record this as happening? And that's when it becomes evidence. Now, I want you to also consider this. We were just talking about in court a little bit ago. John brought this up, right? Witnesses, this is straight from Cornell Law School. They keep a nice encyclopedia of legal terminology and legal things that sort of written in lay language that you can go to and look at and get some understanding of how the legal system works, right? Witnesses can serve as sources of evidence, offering firsthand accounts that can corroborate or refute claims made by parties involved, right? This is important. Testimony is important because this is how you uncover things that might be otherwise hidden. If the only thing admissible is something like DNA evidence, or I found this scrap of cloth at the scene, the suspect or the defendant has a hoodie that's made out of that same color and type of cloth. If you can only use stuff like that, how are you ever going to tell a full story? But if you have testimony, you can uncover some things that help to piece together what actually happened a lot better. And again, it feels a little bit of a double standard for that this is now getting pointed towards Christianity, that you can't use this to prove who Jesus was. We'll use it for everything else. So testimony, again, this is not an uncommon source of evidence. And you can have different types of witnesses who stand up and give their testimony. You got, again, from the same source, they bring out the difference. There's lay witnesses. These are the people that we're generally talking about in the last few minutes. These are people who were just whoever it was that was there, somebody who has personal knowledge of the matter, whether seeing it or hearing something. Yes, at 11:50 p.m. last night, I heard 3 gunshots in that direction from my, upstairs window. Whatever you're seeing or hearing or whatever you're doing, that personal knowledge makes you a witness to that. Or there's expert witnesses, people who have special knowledge in whatever subject is being discussed and can offer that special knowledge and that expertise to help kind of, figure out what does and doesn't apply here to this case. You see this all the time with engineering lawsuits. If the building falls down, you bring in a structural engineer who's not related to the case to have assessed what went on. So, witnesses take different forms. Straight out of the federal rules of evidence, what is or is not sort of admissible in court, what you can and can't do. Straight out of this document in the United States court system, a witness may testify to a matter only if evidence is introduced sufficient to support a finding that the witness has personal knowledge of the matter. Exactly what you were saying earlier, right? Somebody who's going to testify as a reliable witness has to have personal knowledge of what happened. The witness's own testimony is, according to the federal rules of evidence, enough to prove that they have personal knowledge. Also, for your consideration, because again, some finger pointing happens in this debate over who Jesus is by those who do not believe, it's also an integral part of our United States court system. In the federal rules of evidence, a witness's religious beliefs are not admissible to attack or support their credibility. So this is true for us in our court system. Why is this, I'm just asking sort of the rhetorical question, why is this not okay that we have followers of Jesus who testify to him? We must throw their testimony out because they believed in him. I mean, I'm just going to leave that for your consideration there. There's not a whole lot for me to expound on. Religious beliefs are not making a difference in our court system. I don't think they should make a difference here. If you begin to attack their character, witnesses' character, instead of what they actually said at a certain point here. So, yes, David. I ran a 5K yesterday, so I'm getting extra work in today.
Got to keep you limber.
Yes.
Well, one of the other things that I've been noticing as of late, and sort of is that when people are looking at the biblical accounts, they are also applying some unfair standards where they will say, like, for instance, when Peter witnessed the Gentiles having the Holy Spirit fall on him, he wasn't the only witness. There were other believers with him. And now people are saying, well, it doesn't count if I don't also have the believers that were with Peter have their testimony. I need to have the corroborating. So the fact that the scriptures say it, and so the unfair standard is, well, we're 2,000 years after the fact. Right. This was researchable, or able to be investigated at the time, and it passed the test at the time. Right. That's why it stands today.
Right.
Now, 2,000 years later, saying, well, I want to hear the testimony from the guy that was standing next to Peter when this happened. Like, no, that's not possible. Right. And that's an unfair expectation to then say, well, it's not legitimate if it doesn't meet modern criteria. But that's starting to happen. I'm seeing, from skeptics and stuff. So
yes, yeah, very important part of the historical method I had on a few slides ago. Right, all this is done in historical context. You look at what's already been done and already been decided and already been adjudicated about this matter, about any matter, as you are making your conclusions. And so that's a good transition point. Who are the witnesses of Jesus that we have their testimony, so that we can sort of piece together this story? Is it just a few people who were following Jesus and sympathetic to his cause? No, Of course, we have the apostles, we have them, the people who spent the better part of 3 years, almost every waking moment with him, following him, listening to his teachings, seeing his actions, hearing his words. Yes, we have their testimony loud and clear all over the Bible. We also have the women who were following him. We have Mary Magdalene, we have Mary and Martha, the things that they testified to and that they're quoted as saying, and the things that they saw that were recorded. We have more than that. We have his family, right? Again, we said sympathetic witnesses. We're going to get to this in a little bit. His family were not always sympathetic witnesses. That's a very powerful piece later on when we start to talk about James and what he testified to about his brother. But we have the people who experienced his miracles. Their words are given to us. The people who were there watching it and were amazed by it, the people who experienced healing, and we have their words, like the blind man in John 6, 7, I forget what chapter, I don't have it open in front of me. He goes before the Sanhedrin to talk about what he experienced when Jesus healed him. No, he was lame. He says, I don't know who this guy is, but I do know I couldn't walk yesterday. Powerful testimony from these people who experienced the miracles of Jesus. I'll come to some questions and comments in just a second. Again, we talked about this. We have evidence from the Jewish leaders. We have testimony from them, the ones who actually went through the sham trial and put him to death. They were saying things about him that we can use to figure out that the story is true. We have testimony from the Romans. We have the words of Pilate. We have what I call the two centurions, right? The centurion who was at the cross and said, surely this was the Son of God, as the earth shook and the sky went dark. We have the centurion who Jesus healed his child. These are Romans. They are not sympathetic necessarily to his cause. They had to be brought around to this. And we have the people who Jesus appeared to after his resurrection. We have evidence that there was over 500 of them who saw him or heard from him during this time. And we have testimony from several of them, word for word, in the Gospels that Jesus was alive and that they saw his actual resurrected body, not just an empty tomb. So we're going to spend the rest of our time, I'm going to come around for a couple quick comments, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time, grab your Bibles, we're going to be flipping through a lot of scriptures, and we're going to look at the testimony of the apostles. Larry,
Just a couple
Yeah.
observations. So a lot of people will die for a belief that they weren't a party to. They're acceding to an intellectual fact.
yes.
Well, these witnesses are claiming they saw it, and if they knew that they were lying, they were willing to die for that lie.
Yep.
And I think that's a big, big difference, that there was no incentive to perpetrate this lie, i.e. the Apostle Paul.
Right, absolutely. Very powerful. Again, we talk about what the outcome of making these witness statements is. What are they experiencing as a result of giving their testimony? Well, eventually, a lot of them are facing death, knowing that it's coming as they make their testimony, potentially.
Even in court, even the witness that are against, the people. For instance, I think about the guy who was in the Sanhedrin when they were doing the sham trial. He said he's going to cut down the temple and raise it again. Mm-hmm. Well, he really did say that. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So even those things are still witnesses proving the fact that yes, he said it. This is what he did. This is what he said. And here we have 3 days later. So this guy was completely against him, but we can look at, in the court, I would look at it and say, yeah, but you know what, that does prove what he said.
Yep, it does. So we are going to fly here. Grab your Bibles. We're going to look at the apostles' testimony, why we can believe the apostles' testimony. Again, they're the ones who are closest to him. We have the biggest body of statements and testimony from the apostles out of any other source in the New Testament, out of the Gospels, but we're only going to scratch the surface. Number one, we can believe what they said because they were eyewitnesses. The apostles, again, as I said, they were there with him. They saw what he did, and they heard what he said, and their testimony is based on, again, we talked about the legal standard, personal knowledge of Jesus. We have evidence that some of them were initially skeptical, and they later on, they had to be convinced as they went along. They didn't immediately believe, some of them. They were shown some things and became convinced. Whatever it was that they saw was enough to convince them to change their entire lives and follow this man. And based on what they saw, they became courageous. To Larry's point, even to the point of death. So let's talk about this. They were eyewitnesses. Well, what are we pulling this from? Here's some scriptures for you. I left some space here for you to fill in, some of these references if you want to write the references down and go back to them. But consider what Peter says, what Peter claims, and the start of his letter, 2 Peter. He says that he is making known to those who are reading his letter the power and the coming of his Lord Jesus Christ, and we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He says, I saw this man that I'm writing about. John says in chapter 20, it says that Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. And so even more than what we have recorded, Jesus continued to do to confirm who he was and build up their belief. Not to mention everything that John wrote about himself being an apostle of the Lord. In Luke, right? Luke was not an eyewitness, but it's in verses 1 through 4 of his first chapter of his gospel. Luke talks about, hey, there's basically, if I can paraphrase here, lots of people are trying to write down the story and tell this story. And so I'm one of them, and what I'm doing is pulling together things from people who were, end quote, eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account of what happened. He repeats this because Luke also authored the book of Acts. He says this about Jesus as he opens the book of Acts that he wrote, that continues the story after the resurrection. Says, after Jesus' suffering, he presented himself to them, talking about his disciples, and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive and appeared to them over a period of 40 days. So we're hearing from people who are actually there and actually saw them, even to the point of his ascension back to heaven, that resurrected body ascending to heaven. In Acts 1, verse 9, Luke says that it happened before their very eyes. And so these are men who saw from the beginning all the way to the end the things that they are testifying about. But along the way, they had to be convinced. Some of them, even after Jesus' death, that late in the game, they still were not totally sure. Because the apostles thought that when Jesus died, it was all over. Why would I make that statement? Well, what do we read in Mark chapter 14? After Jesus is arrested in the garden, he says, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me there, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. And what happened to the disciples when Jesus was arrested? It says they all left him and fled. So, even in Luke 24, after the resurrection, Mary Magdalene is the one who is recorded as finding this empty tomb first. Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things, about this empty tomb, to the apostles. But these words seemed to the apostles an idle tale, and they did not believe them. They didn't believe the women who found them until they went to go see for themselves. Peter went first, it says, and he went home marveling at what had happened. They needed convincing along the way. So they're making their statements after having received evidence themselves. They're not even just taking it on blind faith, right? So we're getting testimony of people who have gone through this study already, sort of to David's point. They've already gone through the evidence to make the statements that they're going to make. And so I want you to think about two different groups and what their convincing moments looked like. First off, you have what I'm going to call the 10 apostles. Judas has deserted, and Thomas is not here in this moment. So the other 10, in John chapter 20, verses 19 through 23, after Jesus' resurrection and he appears to them, in John chapter 20, it says this, that Jesus showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. So these disciples who fled, Jesus reappears to them, and they are convinced. That leads into our next point later as they become courageous over the things that they have seen. And Thomas, just after that, since Thomas wasn't there, Thomas comes back and they say, hey, we saw Jesus. And what does Thomas say? He says, unless I see the marks on his hands and the wound in his side, I will not believe. And Jesus shows up to Thomas and says, put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. And Thomas answers him, my Lord and my God. He's convinced. What about James? James, the brother of Jesus, not one of the original apostles. But what do we know about James? We talked about his family being a powerful witness here. His family had to be convinced as well, even though brothers and sisters grew up with him. Well, here's James being quoted in John chapter 7, talking to Jesus before he's going to go down to Jerusalem for a feast. He basically says, hey, you're doing all this preaching. Why don't you go down there to Judea that your followers will see these works that you're doing? For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. And if you're actually doing these things, go show yourself to the world. And John quotes here that for not even his brothers believed him. Even when Jesus had started his ministry, his own brothers were not on board. They were not convinced. But how do we jump from that James to the James that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 1 as an apostle? He calls him an apostle in Galatians 1, you see there. And even to the point of James, who then writes a letter as a leader in the church of Jerusalem and calls himself a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. What happened to James that made him go from the one who did not believe him to the apostle and the one who leads the church in Jerusalem and calls himself a servant of Christ? Well, here's what happened. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Here's what happened to James. Paul says, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, to Peter, and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, last of all, me, as Paul. Paul's a special case. We're going to spend a lot of time on Paul in 2 weeks. But think about what he's recording here. James knew with absolute certainty that his brother was dead. Now, he's not recorded as being at the cross, but Mary is. And if Mary says, your brother's dead, he's going to believe his mother. This is not a stretch here. It's possible that James was even there, at least close enough to see what was going on, but he knows with absolute certainty his brother was killed on a cross. And then Jesus appeared to James after the resurrection, along with hundreds of other people, including all of Jesus' followers and best friends. And so James, seeing his brother resurrected, has a check with some other people who also saw him to know, hey, I'm not hallucinating. I saw Jesus. Jesus came and talked to me. Jesus came and showed himself to me. Hundreds of other people, yeah, potentially. Whoever he's in contact with out of those hundreds, yeah, me too. Right? He's not crazy. And so we can believe the testimony based on how convinced they were after these things happened. And I know I've still got some comments and questions. We're going to keep rolling with the 5 minutes that we have here and talk about this courage that the apostles had after what they saw. And we're going to use Peter as an example. What about Peter? Peter knew who Jesus was. He'd even confessed who he was before this happened. But before Jesus' death, as Jesus was arrested and taken before the Sanhedrin, what does he do in John 18? He denies him 3 separate times to 3 separate people, just as Jesus said he would. Right? So he's scared at what's going on. Jesus is about to die, and he's like, oh, maybe if they know I'm with him, I'm next. What does Peter do after Jesus' resurrection? He's in the temple courts preaching about the risen Savior, preaching about Jesus alive again, that he's seen him come back from the dead. even to the point of defying the high priest who's threatening him and the other apostles with prison and with death. Something happened that made Peter courageous. Blaise Pascal, a famous historical scientist, and also a believer, said this: "The allegation that the apostles were imposters is quite absurd." You can't really say it any more plainly than that. Let's follow the charge to its logical conclusion, right? Let's picture those 12 men meeting after Jesus' death and deciding to enter into conspiracy and say that he's risen. If any one of them give way, what he calls, to the more compelling arguments of prison and torture, then all of them would be lost and the whole thing is up. So the alternative to it being true is that it's a conspiracy to spread this message about a resurrected Christ, while stating that these 500 plus other people have also seen him. I can't get my two boys try to get in conspiracy and trick us with things, and they can't keep their story straight. You're going to keep 12 men who are being threatened with prison to keep their story straight through all of this, knowing that they made it up. Here's how far they were willing to take this story about the resurrected Christ. James, beheaded. Philip, crucified. Matthew, slain by the sword. James, the son of Alphaeus, or James the Less, crucified. Matthias, stoned. Andrew, crucified. Peter, crucified upside down because he was not even worthy to be crucified the right way up like Jesus was by tradition. Thaddeus, basically killed by a first century firing squad, shot by arrows. Bartholomew, crucified. Thomas, slain by the spear. Simon the Zealot, crucified. John died in exile, sent away to try to limit the danger. He's the only one who actually lived to an age to die of a natural death. People who die for a lie, this is to Larry's point. If all of this is made up, people who die for a lie do so believing that it's true. You don't die. You don't put yourself on the line for something you know is false. If the resurrection had never happened, the apostles of all people would have known that they were spreading a lie. In J.P. Moreland, this is a quote where he was interviewed as Lee Strobel wrote his book, A Case for Christ. J.P. Moreland, a PhD, a theologian, says, "And these disciples, these apostles, were willing to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming this resurrection message. For what? For good intentions? No, because they were convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had seen Jesus Christ alive from the dead." And this quote from William Lane Craig, also from the same book, A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. I highly recommend this book to you. It's in the same vein of what we're studying together here. William Lane Craig also quoted as saying this. Think about we're going to talk about the resurrection next week in detail, but sort of to prime you for this, get you some things to think about. The site of Jesus' tomb was known to Christians and Jews alike. They know where they laid him. It was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. So if it wasn't empty, it would be impossible for a movement founded on belief in the resurrection to have come into existence in the same city where Jesus had been publicly executed and buried. Everybody knew it happened, whether you were for him or against him. Everybody saw the spectacle. Everybody saw his body being taken down off the cross to get it done in time for the Sabbath and being laid in Joseph's tomb. If it wasn't empty, how do we get to where we are today? So in preparation for next week, if you want to read ahead, it's chapters 8. And by the way, here, just for finishing off here, got the check mark there, these eyewitnesses. We can trust what they were saying. There's too much on the line. They saw too much. There's too much that the stories line up. It couldn't have been a conspiracy. And so we can trust those eyewitnesses. What we have that Jesus claimed is what he claimed. Next week, Jesus' death and his resurrection, we're going to go through 2 chapters. If you have the older version of the book, it's chapters 8 and 10. Paul's kind of squished in the middle. We're going to kick Paul to 2 weeks later. It's chapters 7 and 9 if you have the newer version of the book with the blue bookmark. If you're missing some handouts, those are available online on our resources tab on our website, or I've got some hard copies down here. I've also got copies of the More Than a Carpenter book available if anybody still wants one. Thanks for being here.